Welcome to Global Engagement and Erasure on the Liberal Arts campus. Today we are joined by Sourav Guha, Amy Dooling, and Sheetal Chhabria. And to introduce our speakers for today, I want everyone please welcome Aruna, our student host.
Hello, friends. My internet has decided to quit on me today, so you will not be seeing my face, unfortunately, but hopefully my voice comes through. I'm Aruna. I'm a senior at Connecticut College, and I'm the current program coordinator for race and ethnicity programs. And I have the honor today of welcoming our guests. Speaking on the panel today is from Wesleyan and has gone on to get further masters from University of Michigan, Virginia Tech, among other institutions. His work focuses on having conversations and creating initiatives to identify and remove barriers to equity and inclusion in higher education. And to serve that purpose, he currently serves as the executive director of the Consortium on High Achievement and Success, which is an organization dedicated to furthering the successes of scholars of color at selective liberal arts institutions. Welcome, Sourav. Speaking with him, we have our very own Dean, Amy Dooling, who's a scholar of modern Chinese literature. She has written extensively on the role of women and feminism in 20th century Chinese literature, and works at Connecticut College as the Associate Dean of Global Initiatives. She is also the director of the Walter Commons for Global Study and Engagement, where her work focuses on coordinating the college's global education effort, including the study away programs and world language programs. Welcome, Dean Dooling. Also with them is Professor Sheetal Chhabria from the History Department. She was the founder and director of the Power and Knowledge Pathway, which she headed up until last year, and is a historian of South Asia, where her work focuses on the global histories of capitalism and urban studies, as well as the production of poverty and inequality, which were the main themes in her acclaimed book, Making the Modern Slum, The Power of Capital in Colonial Bombay. Welcome, Professor Chhabria.
I think that I will just jump in straight away here to say a few words. Thank you so much for those introductions. And to clarify a few things about this panel. First of all, I want to thank Sourav for proposing this excellent topic. It's a very, we're going to talk a little bit about the description that he crafted for this panel. It's very provocative in some of the questions he raises, but I just want to give him credit for proposing the topic. I want to thank my colleague, Dean McKnight, for connecting the two of us. So Sourav and I have gotten to know each other a little bit over the past couple of weeks. I want to also clarify that I am less of a speaker and more of a moderator of this dialogue that we're going to be hearing for the next hour and a half. I probably, sort of knowing me, will be jumping in from time to time. I can't help myself because the topic of global engagement is very important to me. But my role will be to monitor the chat, make sure that we leave lots of space for questions from the audience. This really is meant to be an informal conversation, hopefully a lively, thought-provoking, interesting dialogue between two very smart people who have a lot to say about what global engagement is and isn't, whether we are practicing it on our campuses or not. But it is an informal conversation. Professor Chhabria and Sourav have only just met, so this really will be an authentic exchange of ideas and perspectives. So who knows what, it'll be interesting to see, how they engage with one another. But again, I invite the audience to ask questions along the way, use the chat function. There are a lot of you, so it'll be, and we don't see your faces. So, I think the chat function is the best way to signal that you've got a question. We intend to leave, probably 20 minutes, maybe more, depends on how the conversation goes, for an open Q&A from the audience. So with that, I think that I will, unless either of you have something you want to start with at the very beginning, I do have a kind of opening question. I have a few sort of basic questions that I'm going to be asking just to kind of move things along, but I'm hoping that the dialogue will kind of take a life of its own. So Sourav or Sheetal, is there anything that you wanted to clarify about who you are, why you're here today before we get started?
Go ahead.
I'm good.
You're good. And I did see one thing that's come into the chat.
That was me.
Okay.
I just asked if folks can turn on their video, but only if you can. That'd be nice. It's always good to see people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to see people's reactions. It's very hard to talk to just sort of names on the screen. So thank you for that.
But don't feel pressure.
I'm going to just, yeah. I see people turning their cameras on. So hello, everyone. Good to see your faces. I am going to start with a basic, but I think it's a pretty fundamental question, which is really how is the topic of global engagement and its erasure connected to the core theme of this conference, the Elevate conference, which is really about the pursuit of social justice. So I think that, these days, most people, probably everybody, who's tuning in right now, assumes, right, that global engagement is a really important topic in international education circles, right? Certainly, a really big buzzword at international conferences these days. But might be wondering how it's really connected to issues of equity and inclusion and justice. So, I just want to throw out, just so we kind of address that head on, why do we have a panel like this in the Elevate conference? Sourav, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I was thinking about this relative to a few of the events I had the privilege of attending yesterday, and particularly the coded bias screening, actually last night. And in a way, I think that, like, in a sense, all intellectual work is sort of developing algorithms. You're trying to make predictions and generalizations to some extent. It's different in different disciplines in terms of some disciplines sort of have the hubris of making much larger generalizations based on different sorts of evidence. But, and I think, that argument in coded bias is fundamentally like, who's designing the algorithms and what is the evidentiary base? And, I think that film makes a pretty good argument. I think that having a bunch of tech bros mine the data of other white men and then make generalizations that would apply all across society is profoundly problematic. Both intellectually, it doesn't work, and morally, it's problematic. And in a sense, I think in a lot of historically on our campuses, that's really kind of what's been happening. And of course, over the past 20, 25 years, there have been some changes along the margins, but the history of the American Academy is basically white men making observations about the world, often very narrow slivers of the world, and then reaching conclusions that supposedly apply to everyone and everything. And so I think in that sense, it applies pretty directly to some of the themes that came up last night. I was also thinking of Ibu Patel's talk and some of the things he didn't mention in his talk. He talked quite a bit about radical love, but I didn't think he sort of acknowledged King's radical critique of society, especially in King's later years when he talks about the three evils, the evil of racism, the evil of poverty, the evil of war. And I think you can't really understand those evils without understanding global capital, colonialism, how all of the world is really tightly integrated in so many different ways. So I think how we understand social justice really demands that we think about how we're situated in the world, that the contingencies and contexts, historically, politically, economically.
I suppose you want me to just follow up. Nice to meet you, Sourav, and I agree with what you said. I didn't get to see this film yesterday, but Amy and I have talked about this quite a bit, but I think for long, even historically, even as early as the early 20th century, people debated whether justice was possible in a local setting, or whether if you just create justice in a local setting, you've actually now displaced problems elsewhere. So today we're sitting through what might be a huge, the beginning of a union movement at Amazon. And although I support that, I'm also very concerned that when that doesn't come with some sort of transnational awareness and global awareness, that it's very easy for Amazon to just go to some other place then and extract cheap labor and cheap goods, right? So in that way, the world's always already connected. And we have to take that sort of very broad perspective about justice, I think. So unfortunately, I think on our campuses, what happens is a lot of domestic issues are dealt with in a justice-minded way, whereas issues that happen extra domestically or topics that are studied extra domestically are studied or presented as if they were about representation or inclusion and things like that without an eye to justice. So I think just answering Amy's question, I think justice, just as power is always already global, so justice has to be also. So it's incredibly important that we attend to the sort of empirical realities of the world, which are that the world is a deeply connected place, and that's not new, it's quite old, and do a better job of dealing with that and presenting that to our students.
So, thank you for starting us off with those thoughts. I think that you both, in different ways, pointed to the fact that, of course there is, a deep connection between global education, sort of writ large, right, in the development of the capacity for global engagement, its connection to the project of advancing social justice. But then, of course, there's the question of like, all right, so we see that potential, we see the connection. What are we living up to that, in terms of the education that we are delivering to students on liberal arts campuses? And so I wanted to actually get you to think a little bit about the description that Sourav wrote for this panel. So he actually sort of referenced this 19th century historian, he was also a politician, British, Thomas Babbington Macaulay, right? And he quotes, right, there's a very notorious quote that's often, you see it referred to a lot, in which this guy, Macaulay, proclaimed, and I'm gonna just read it here. He says, "No one could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia." So I'm sure some of you are really familiar with this quotation. But Sourav goes on to provocatively ask the following question, and this is what I'd like you both to kind of help unpack a bit. So this is the question that Sourav came up with. Does the curricular underrepresentation of the Global South across the humanities and social science departments of 21st century US liberal arts institutions not suggest at least tacit agreement with and adherence to Macaulay's 19th century colonial perspective? Okay, so there's a lot there that I think you could help us, just unpack it for us. Maybe offer us a definition of what you mean by the Global South. You know, does a Western colonial perspective is it really operative still, you know, in our curriculum in the 21st century? You know, what does that look like? How is it showing up? So sorry, that's a monstrous question, but let me throw it to the two of you to talk about.
Sheetal, do you want to start first this time, or would you like me to?
I can if you want, but you're welcome to go ahead since you wrote it. Why don't you?
Okay. You know, I was thinking in a, you know, kind of just basic way in terms of if you look at the faculty lines, the courses that are offered in literature departments, in film studies departments, in history departments, political science, etc. You know, if you think about even just like a single country, India, has a bigger population than all of North and South America put together. And, you know, if we look at sort of the global distribution of people and what's projected over the next 30 years, it really is, you know, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia that are expected to continue to grow. So as we, you know, prepare students for this world that they're going to inhabit, which domestically is increasingly diverse, internationally, these economies in other parts of the world that are often neglected continue to grow, and there's a lot of influence that way. Culturally, you know, like I mentioned film studies, for example, like, you know, Bollywood is the world's largest film producing industry. You know, there's centers of production in other places in terms of the arts. So, you know, there's a lot of where in certain ways a multipolar world, in other ways not. I mean, obviously the US has a lot of power politically and economically that exerts in a particular way, but without having any sort of exposure, understanding, and appreciation of other parts of the world. The fact that, you know, you could graduate as, you know, a student from any of our campuses and not really have much exposure to anything other than kind of a really kind of mainstream American perspective in a lot of ways, just strikes me as particularly problematic.
So I am officially a historian, so I actually have a ton I could say about Macaulay, but I'm going to restrain myself. But this line, right, that the single shelf of whatever text is not worth as much as an entire library, that's been repeated a lot and is taught to those of us who get like PhDs in South Asian studies and all, as proof that the West has always been racist against our cultures or something. It turns out if you dig a bit further, though, that that's not actually a very historically accurate claim. So there's a line that I'll just nerd out a little bit. There's a line that comes after that. I'll just put it in the chat. That comes after that thing, where Macaulay says, basically, at the end, he says, to trade with civilized men is infinitely more profitable than to govern savages. And so it turns out the reason he was so interested in getting rid of the Orientalist learning and replacing it with English learning was because this would allow the colonial regime to govern on the cheap. Otherwise, India would turn into a very dependent colony, which would cost a lot of money. Whereas if people were trained in English and they could speak English and they could use English cutlery and all this stuff, they would trade in English goods. And it was through commerce that the civilizing mission would occur. And so, and the interesting thing about it is that Indian nationalists in the 1880s and 1890s took this up and they used Macaulay's claim to say, look, the British didn't rule us the way they said they would have. We want to participate in free trade and in commerce, and they just have failed at their duty. So for me, what that brings up is that, I mean, I'm going to say something probably not very expected, I guess. But I wonder why we should bother teaching about other places. Now, it's true that the population of India is large and the population of China is large and all this stuff, but in many ways, institutions like ours are designed to train people to manage populations, to enter institutions of governance that will perpetuate the status quo. So in many ways, what these institutions are designed to do is to create a managerial class that aids in the project of a continued imperial governance, although we don't call that now. Today, we just have global capitalism or something, right? And so it might be better if we didn't teach our students about those places, because I don't want young students to go and learn how to manage the population of India. And I don't want them to, and it makes me very nervous when that's what we try to create, right? It would be very different if the students who came onto these campuses also came from those places. I could say so much more. I'll just say one thing, which is the pandemic and Zoom learning and whatnot has made it so that I have several young people from India have contacted me saying, can I come to your classes? And I let two of them like come into my Zoom class for a class I teach called Globalization of Urban Poverty. And they didn't say anything because they were so just culturally unprepared for this space. But I know them, I've interacted with them so much. And these are people who come from very poor areas in India. And they would just benefit so much from what Connecticut College has to offer. And I have no way of getting them here. If it wasn't for pandemic, I could have never even like gotten them into the class, right? So I guess everything I'm saying is basically asking a couple of questions. For whose benefit do we ever provide an education? Is it for our students, or is it for the people who we offer up to them as objects of study? And also, and I'll just say, and then once we figure that out, which requires asking, like, what does justice look like? What's the medium by which we get there? What's actually the curriculum that we would need to create agents of justice rather than more people who do more of the globe or something like that? Okay, I'll stop there.
So you've been, between the two of you, you've introduced many different threads that we could follow. You know, one has to do with a kind of disconnect, I think, that Sourav has identified between sort of what constitutes the liberal arts curriculum today, whether it's in terms of the languages that we teach, the kind of study abroad programs we offer, the courses that we offer, and you know, what is actually happening in the world, right? I mean, it is true, if you look at the data out there, there's a wonderful, for those of you who may not be aware of this, every year the State Department, in conjunction with the Institute of International Education, puts together this report called the Open Doors Report. And it really traces, you know, what are the trends in sort of the flows of students outside of the United States coming to the US to study. And as you probably are aware, right, those numbers are skyrocketing. Well, they were until, you know, the Trump administration and the pandemic. The numbers of international students on our campuses was really growing quite exponentially. And who those students are has shifted pretty dramatically over the last 20 years. So, I mean, to Sheetal, to your question, like, who are we educating? You know, we have a sizable number of international students who are part of our campus communities these days, right? It's, you know, at Con, I mean, John McKnight might know the number off the top of his head. I think it's about 12% international students, you know, and the largest numbers are coming from China and India. But anyway, so I mean, it is our campus communities, and I think American society now encompasses people from all parts of the globe. So it's kind of incumbent on us to be able to connect with each other and communicate with each other. But sorry, I'm getting off track here. So there is something of a disconnect between sort of how we are sending our students abroad and which countries and cultures and languages they're studying, and sort of what is happening in the world at large that we could explore further. I think, Sheetal, you also are, you are kind of implicitly talking a little bit about the project of area studies, right? And the fact that we did, sort of in the century following Macaulay, there was a massive curricular development, which is called area studies, right? Let's teach about these parts of the world that are beyond the West, beyond Western Europe. And I mean, I myself am the product of that kind of education, and to a certain extent, I think you are too. And that is a project, which is how can we better equip, America to govern, right, and carry out its will and policy in the world. So you might talk a little bit more about that project and where it is now that we're in the 21st century. So I don't know, do either of you want to follow up on any of those? The question of area studies, is that project done? Have we moved on to something new?
I don't know if I want to say anything about area studies specifically, because I think those of you who are more sort of deeply embedded in that sort of intellectual and academic environment maybe would have something more to say about that. But I think, this question of like, for whose benefit, I think is a really important one. And, I agree that just sort of picking up trivia about other parts of the world as some sort of fascinating objects of study is not particularly useful. But I think that invariably our students, whether they are going to teach English or join the Peace Corps, or maybe they're going to do some sort of, you mentioned the idea of the global South and how, as geographers would say, there's uneven economic development throughout the world. And so, our students go join programs like Teach for America. And so we kind of have a missionary sort of approach sometimes domestically as well. And that might be another point of connection there with ethnic studies within the United States. But I do think that, like, invariably our students are going to be working in the State Department, are going to be going out to all sorts of places, and there are going to be impacts. So when we drummed up war after 9/11, a recent study came out that as a direct consequence of the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there are 37 million people in the world who have been displaced, who are refugees. So meanwhile, we're having these incredibly racist conversations about a tiny number of refugees entering our country and what we owe them, when we ourselves have very directly created the conditions under which they have refugee status. So I think just understanding that in terms of being even just an educated citizen of the United States, when we hold so much power, I think hopefully to like inform that a little bit. And maybe also it ties back to actually what Sheetal was saying about like Macaulay's Minute and that argument about governance in India, for example. And yes, it did carry the day, and that sort of indirect colonial apparatus worked. And in fact, it worked so well that when Indians wrote their own constitution in 1950, they actually took chunks verbatim of the Government of India Act of 1935. They took a colonial governing apparatus and made it the basis of the structure for an independent India. And so when we think about, again, the uneven economic development, what's going on in these countries, what it means to be a post-colonial society, I think we need to understand those complicated histories in those places. I think there's a lot of different levels to it, but I do think that invariably we're connected to those other parts of the world because of the power differential. And I think there needs to be some level of thoughtful education about those other parts of the world.
I think I'll just agree with what Sourav said right there too. It seems to me what Sourav is describing is educating to create a political will. And that can be done at home, that can be done abroad, you can use any group of people or places to incite a bunch of students to think about the way in which their own government has been responsible for not just international displacement, but internal displacement, everyday structural violence, putting millions and millions of people into debt, wars all over the place. I mean, there is lots of blood on the US government's hands, and you can find any topic, and it's not just abroad, it's also at home. The issue of India using colonial era stuff, that's of course just today is India's Republic Day, and there's a huge outbreak of violence in Delhi right now because farmers who've been sitting in Delhi for over a month have been attacked by police. So the Indian government has never wanted to shake off its colonial masters. It's always wanted to replicate, it's the will to power that almost everybody has. And when we educate in order to empower our students, we're kind of doing them a disservice. What we ought to do is build in them a political will to resist power. And if we all got on board for that project, then I would offer up India, and I would say, hey, let's teach about India, because I want an army of people to give a shit about India and to help all the people there who are struggling so much. But if it's to create, but I don't think that's what's being on offer, actually. Also, I'll just say about area studies and disciplines, I've said this before, those of you who know me, but the distinction between area studies and disciplines is very much an arbitrary one. A philosophy department is really very much an area studies department. It's a Western European studies department. An English department is, that one's easy. Sociology is also notoriously nationalistic, right? And history is not off the hook. I'm grateful that I'm in a department that values global history a lot, but that's not the case in most places. So disciplines have are in many ways area studies departments of their own. They just shed their place-based biases by calling themselves a discipline. So, it is important to study, to understand the US's role in other places, and that's a big problem. It's also important to become somewhat literate about the rest of the world. That basic literacy would be good, right? But I think that the ends and means have to be sorted out and clarified so much in order for this not to become a dangerous project and for it to become a more useful one.
I think another, structurally, in many ways, our institutions don't want us to be asking these questions. Vijay Prashad, who used to teach at Trinity, used to start his semesters by having students research the histories of the named buildings on campus. And it's pretty fascinating. I don't know anything about condoms, certainly as a alumnus of Wesleyan. I know the troubling histories of a number of the buildings on that campus, but it's not only older buildings that have been named recently. Our Center for the Study of Public Life at Wesleyan was named after an alum, Robert Alberton, who graduated in the 90s. His family made their money through Riggs Bank, which is known as the Bank of the Dictators. They basically laundered Pinochet's money, and that's how they made money. And then our campuses act as reputation laundering institutions for these ill-gotten gains. And so there's, at so many different levels, well, since we don't want to, the idea of educating to resist power is so, and it's difficult in the same way, John and I work on DEI work, but how could we possibly talk about equity when our institutions are fundamentally premised on and prefer and prosper based on inequity, and that's what we're built on. So I think there are a lot of inherent contradictions that do make it difficult for sure, but there are also that also offers opportunities, I think, like in terms of these local spots where these different challenges intersect in a physical place on our campuses, and maybe offer an opportunity to inspect some of that.
I want to remind everybody to use the chat function if you have some questions around any of the ideas that Sheetal and Sourav are talking about here. I want to, both of you are, put your finger on so many important things, right? How do we educate to, create a kind of political will to resist among our students? How do we deepen students' basic historical knowledge, of the world, right? I mean, I know we've got a couple of historians here, so they'll be happy to hear me say that, right? I mean, we do a terrible job in general with teaching history, but how do we teach, how do we develop a curriculum so that students understand the deeper context around the phenomenon that we all see? How do we get students to understand the role of the United States in creating many of the global challenges that we're now facing today, right? So I guess the question that I have for the two of you is, where are there some opportunities right now on a 21st century liberal arts campus to make some of these changes? Is it, we all know how hard it is to change curricula. I mean, in part it's institutional, right? We hire faculty are here, we have departmental structures. Changing those are very, very difficult. But are there other opportunities that we see where we could begin to, advance the kind of education we think is needed at this moment in time? And my mind goes to, kind of social justice education and some of the concepts that we're now talking about. Intergroup dialogue, intercultural dialogue, talking about the analysis of power. I mean, are there some concepts out there that we might be able to connect to the project of global engagement and education that could be useful? So I guess the question is, where is there, we've identified some problems, are there some solutions that you might suggest for us to consider? Sheetal, I see you've unmuted yourself.
If I could just say one thing, I'm always struck when I teach how, if I mention public goods versus private goods, how many students don't know the difference between those things. And you would think, and the reason I bring that up, and this is not to blame the students, of course, it just shows how much of a failure our even basic education is before they get to college, to not be able to identify the difference between a public good versus a private good. So I always think of what are some key concepts or key words that everyone should learn, right, in order to be able to even start thinking about justice. And that would be, I think, a good place to start. I think a lot of people don't even know what we mean by capitalism, or what we mean by imperialism, or what we mean by what is even history. We can provide historical education, but why do people care about history so much, and what is history? There's so many things like that before we talk about changing curriculum, that if we just get to, it's a basic failure of the public education system, and it's not the fault of the public education system. We've defunded it so much that people show up very unprepared to take on the question of how to solve China's problems or whatever, right? That's all.
Sourav, do you have any thoughts on this? opportunities
And I guess in
to
terms
make some
of,
changes?
yeah, what you're saying about, earlier you referenced how our campuses might be changing in composition. Maybe that was set back a little bit over the last few years. But the fact that they're, I guess this goes a little bit against our model of like hierarchical knowledge and like professors bestowing knowledge to students. But the fact that we are increasingly globally as well as domestically, maybe drawing from a more diverse pool of students, trying to structure opportunities in which students can learn more from each other, and develop meaningful relationships the way, we talk about a living and learning space on a residential liberal arts campus, and so much of the learning obviously happens from outside the classroom. And I think certainly those things that you were talking about in terms of like dialogue type programs, which would facilitate that, I think could be very helpful potentially. I think it's also the case that, with the exception of a handful of institutions which are need blind for international students, our international students oftentimes come from certain segments of their countries in certain classes. And we can be, at the same time that folks are being educated, they're also maybe amongst each other as they interact. There can also be blind spots that are maybe being perpetuated. So I think there has to be, I guess, some awareness and care in terms of that. I would say, going back to what Sheetal said about like how really everything is sort of area studies, whether we admit it or not, it is possible, I think, if faculty were willing, when you're teaching political philosophy and you're talking about someone like John Stuart Mill, who is, such a foundational figure for liberal thought, perhaps it should be introduced that he was a lifelong employee of the East India Company, that although he was the liberal, it was Burke, the conservative, who thought that maybe India should be on its own. And, Mill, who had a very paternalistic attitude towards India and how it should be governed. And, I think it would complicate some of these ideas that we learn and the people we learn about, even within the Western canon, if we offered a little bit more global context to their ideas and biographies. And that would, I think, enrich the conversation a lot when we're thinking about these ideas and how they apply in real world contemporary contexts.
Can I just say one more thing too, which is, the fact that we get students from abroad is not necessarily something to be celebrated. Basically, the US government, through the IMF and the World Bank, demands that other places in the world shut down and defund their public resources. And so education spending is on the down low for every developing country. And that's because the US demands it so that they can take loans from us. And so then the kids from there are like, I need an education. It looks like there's no school nearby that's going to be good enough for me to compete in this economy. And somebody just came over from the US. I guess I have to go to the US. Very unpleasant experience, right? If we really cared, we should be making sure that people can stay at their house and get the education that they want. We should be allying with institutions in places like India, or wherever we pluck the students out of, and say, hey, what can we do to help your education system so that you can produce educated, thoughtful citizens over there who will be our transnational partners in making a better world where we solve climate crisis and where we solve the fact that Jeff Bezos is stealing everyone's money and whatever else is going on in the world, right? And booking his ticket to Mars or whatever he's doing to get away from it all at the same time. I think maybe this is a little bit what Sourav was getting at, but a lot of our students that come from abroad come from either they're financially wealthy or they're culturally wealthy. They've already had a kind of capital invested in them that would allow them to be in a place like this. So it's an unpleasant truth, but that's the truth. And, yeah, I don't know what to say.
I think we have a couple of questions that are coming up from the audience. Linnea Hussein has a question, as does Tristan Boer. So why don't you just unmute yourself and ask the question directly? So why don't we start with Linnea?
All right, thank you so much. Linnea Hussein, visiting assistant professor in film studies. Thank you. This conversation is really stirring up a lot of things I always think about. So, and particularly something Professor Chhabria was just saying about why don't we move away from the paradigm of representation, right? Because I keep thinking, as someone who teaches film, it is irresponsible to have international students in America and teach them as if they had the same opportunities as American citizens. It is impossible to get a special talents visa age 21 or whatever, unless you've won an Oscar, right? So there are just, teachers need to be also aware of the limitations, and they cannot take an internship. You cannot get paid, right? There are a lot of limitations international students have that need to be acknowledged, other than, oh, wow, we now have the United Colors of Benetton on our campus, right? And I think that also makes me think about the job market, the current academic job market, which is, I think, also another level of this discussion, because on the one hand, I think it's amazing how we see in the past 9 months, however many positions are still open and still have funding, they really do seem to put an emphasis on, however cynical you want to be, on Black and Brown and international hires. However, I see a very ugly backlash from people on the market, on Americans, on white liberal citizens who are complaining that, oh, just because you're a woman, or just because you're brown, or just because of this or this and this, you get a job. So to change this fundamental understanding, it is not about representing, not about having just this, little chair at the table, but to understand, what does it mean to be international? What does it mean to be Black or brown or a different body? And what kind of experiences do we bring? And so that faculty and student alike actually stop seeing it as like something that, it's just about a photo op, or and I'm aware I'm being hyper cynical here, but just to wonder, how can we think about this also in our syllabi design, for instance, right? Like how do we, I'm guilty of this myself sometimes, like how do you move away from 1 week on Bollywood, 1 week on Nollywood, 1 week on disability, right? Like, so how else can we think about it? And I don't have the answer, but I'm curious to see if this sparks anything with you.
You want us to take questions, all of them, Amy, and then?
Well, why don't you just, I think these are excellent questions that have just been raised. So Sheetal, do you want to respond to that?
I just wanted to say something about Bollywood. Bollywood, I'm just going to officially say it's crap. It's movies that teach people, that school the young in patriarchy, violence, misogyny, nationalism, jingoism, greed, selfishness, right? So I don't know what you're going to do with that, but I'm telling you, in putting Bollywood into, and I don't know.
Oh, no, it would be an example of a capitalist film industry. I wouldn't teach it because it's wonderful and it's cultural representation.
Right. Okay, but Bollywood is particularly just a mess, and and supports the fascist regime in India, and also
it was just a stand-in. So if it's Indian art house cinema from the 60s or something, right? But I'm just trying to think through, like, in my Arab cinema class, what I tried to do is to spend like 3-4 weeks on a region or something to try to embed it more. But I'm just, this is something.
Right. So I guess what I was getting at though is, like, if we want to move beyond representation, right? What am I saying? Replace representation with is the teaching of a political will. Mm-hmm. So then we choose things in our curriculum, in our syllabi, that will generate a political will in students. And that might, and maybe some of those movies will come from India. Maybe some of those will come from anywhere else. I don't know. But the fact that they come from India won't be their virtue. Mm-hmm. What will be their virtue is that they teach a political will, or they provide a site from which you can teach a political will. And so I think that's what it would look like to move beyond representation, is to be very clear that the only point of education is to produce the political will. And in order to do that, the educator themselves has to be very clear on, well, what kind of political will do I want to produce? What does justice look like? And what's the direction I'm going in? And not just, present a sort of buffet of variety or something, right?
Thank you.
I think that Professor Bohr has a question, and then Dean McKnight. So, Kristen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both panelists. This is so thought-provoking. And I just wanted to go back to something that Professor Chhabria said earlier about, what happens before our students get into Connecticut College or other colleges like ours. And this is something I talk with my students a lot about. How do you sort of cut the white saviorism of, going to the so-called third world? And they talk a lot about the pressure they face in high school to do volunteer work and, what it takes, that they're told from a very early stage, like your resume has to look a certain way and that's how you're going to get into a good college. And so I think, it starts before they get here in terms of like, what are we preparing them to do? I mean, are they going to the orphanage in Uganda so that they can, put it on their resume so they can get into Connecticut College? And, sadly, we have looked at some of the essays that work on our own website at Connecticut College, and some of them are pretty white saviory, actually. I mean, we have chosen, like, you want to get into Connecticut College, write an essay like this. And some of them are kind of cringeworthy. And so I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, but I did think that it people who are making decisions about what kind of application gets you into a college like Connecticut College have to also be part of the conversation, I think.
Would either of you like to respond to this? You actually have to.
I definitely agree completely with the last thing the Professor Bohr said. I've worked in undergraduate and graduate admissions, undergraduate at Wesleyan and graduate at Yale. And I do think that like the disconnect between how admissions has been professionalized in a particular way. I mean, it's really like, it is kind of that sort of like collecting different sorts of students. There's like this supply chain of students and you're just like assembling them. It's very capitalistic in a lot of ways, very much disconnected from really thoughtful engagement with the intellectual and moral mission of the campus. And I do think that that level of specialization, professionalization, and sort of our administrative staff and how disconnected it is from the intellectual heart of what happens on a campus is tremendously counterproductive and creates a lot of challenges for sure. So yeah, I'm in complete agreement with you on that.
I'll just echo too, I think this would be volunteerism, and what's the work that does in our society is something I think every student should become very clear on, which is it allows our society to displace our problems onto others. It prevents us from looking at structural issues and understanding them. It lets us off the hook, makes us feel like, oh, I did something, so I don't have to worry about the fact that on the rest of my life, I'm actually an agent of all the crap that I tried to go and solve, right? So like, I think that's another thing. It's actually about justice. Like that would be one of those terms that I think every person with a bachelor's degree should have some literacy on. So that's my answer.
I will say, I mean, we have a couple more questions, but I can't help myself. I do think that on our campus, there has been an important shift in how we think about global engagement. I mean, one, that it's not synonymous with study abroad, right? And two, that it's not an activity. You don't just go and like get some global engagement, right? Do this thing and you're done, right? For the purposes of like credentializing. I think that we're doing a much better job in engaging students in difficult conversations around positionality and intention, and the fact that there needs to be some kind of reciprocity, right, in the kinds of partners that we are working with, right? It's not about just going and having an experience, right, for your own kind of advancement, but that we really need to be thinking about, what is the nature of that interaction and what is happening in the communities? What is our responsibility with respect to the communities that we're working with. And so we're trying, it's slow, but I think we're trying to shift towards thinking about partnership in a different way than we have in the past, where it's really been a kind of transactional relationship with other institutions and other communities. So, I mean, I think that the conversation is changing. And I think that the way that we are structuring opportunities is shifting slowly. Not to say that we still, you know, we still sometimes get trapped in the kind of white savior mode. Volunteering, helping discourse is very powerful still. I see 2 more questions and we have 4 minutes. So I want to give Dean McKnight, oh, he has generously offered to let Aruna ask her question first. So go ahead. Oh, and Professor Forster as well.
Thank you, Dean McKnight. I want to get back a little bit to what you guys were talking about a little while ago, which was regarding developing this idea of partnering with other people, partnering with people who you're studying, who are internationals, who are belonging to different cultures, and moving away from giving students like this shallow understanding of like a cultural study of another place to a deeper understanding of what really constitutes the socio-economic, political struggles that that place is facing, and how they can contribute to the struggles that are occurring. For example, in India, something which Charlene Carruthers mentioned in her talk yesterday, and something that you always mention, Professor Chhabria, is that people have to get a sense that their struggle is tied in with the struggle of other people. If we want, you know, genuine efforts, genuine political will to be formed. And I was wondering, you know, in the context of global studies, in the context of teaching people about different countries, you know, even from this country, how do we generate that sort of a mindset of actually all of our struggles are intertwined? And that's why I want to help you, not because I'm like a white savior, not because I've studied you once in one semester.
You know, the fact, I'll just give some examples. The fact that education has been privatized has happened in this country and elsewhere at the same time. The fact that water is now dangerous to drink for lots of people, for increasingly more, and the air is dangerous to breathe, is happening here and there. The fact that education is about credentialing rather than citizenship is happening here and there. Our struggles are certainly intertwined. The fact that policing is the way in which governments solve problems rather than its investment, that's happening here and there. So there's, and it's the same people, actually. There's some studies that show there's about 100 men that benefit from these structures across the world. Jeff Bezos is one of them. The guy who owns Tesla is another, but nonetheless, right? So they are always connected, and being able to show that and demonstrate that in a classroom or whatever and raise that kind of consciousness, I think can go a long way. And what the takeaway then is that you don't have to go abroad. You have to start contesting the powers that be right where you are. And that, you know, but I'm sure there's a ton more. So I'm just, in the interest of time, just trying to be quick.
Actually, we have 15 minutes more. I was under the impression that we were done at 2:15, but we actually have a full 15 minutes left, which is great because it seems like there's still plenty of questions that people have. So I think, John, did you have a question at this point?
Yeah, I did. This is so thought-provoking. Thank you all. And I've written a lot of notes, mostly questions. I'm just thinking, Sheetal, about your comments on developing political will and kind of common definition of what seem to be important basic concepts like justice, right? That it seems like, given what you've said, and I completely agree, coming from education, about the remedial sort of work that has to be done to get to a basic point of understanding. I'm just wondering, what is the structural kind of way of addressing this from where we sit within an institution of higher education? I feel like classroom by classroom might not quite be at the scale or the speed that we need or we want in terms of really righting the wrongs of global engagement and global education. So, and this is a question we can sit with. I don't know if there's an answer definitively today, but I'm obviously, from where I sit, thinking, how do we scale up and speed up this work beyond the sort of individual kind of teaching that happens within a classroom? And so tied to that, I would also just ask, do you sense, do any of you faculty who teach in these areas, do you sense a curiosity among students? Like, is there even an interest in this kind of education that we're talking about?
John, you and I could talk about this for a while, but I tend to think problems are harder to understand, solutions are easier to come up with, actually, much harder to implement. But think of Connecticut College, we have an entire first-year seminar program. Imagine if the first-year seminar program was not Professor so-and-so, what is the thing you want to teach? But instead, here are the 6 things every freshman has to think about. The politics of critical thought or something. Imagine if that was the only first-year seminar class. This stuff isn't hard. It's just that we don't have the will. We pretend our students lack political will. It's actually us that lacks political will. Students show up to the world disenchanted. They come to college disenchanted, confused, disoriented, concerned, and all sorts of stuff. And we give them all sorts of stuff to pass their time with. In Rhode Island last year, a bunch of students sued the state for not providing them civic education. Students care. Like, I think young people care because they're going to live with this stuff. We might have a couple of decades left on this planet, and they're going to live with this a lot longer than you and I. So we're confusing them, actually, when we refuse to make a curriculum. And that's on us. So I think there's lots of opportunities and simple ones. We just lack the will.
I don't think that there is, an easy answer to this question. I also don't think that there's a single strategy, right? I mean, I think that, we could come up with many, many different places, opportunities for us to intervene, and we should seize all of them, whether it's a freshman seminar program. I mean, I do think general education is one place where you can make significant change for all students, so that it's not just, an optional thing that some students might choose, right? So general education is a particularly powerful place to make change. But I do think that if we, for us here at Con, I think that we need to continue to think about our mission statement. I mean, we talk about us being a mission-driven institution and how important the mission should inform everything we do. And we have this, it's a highly contested idea of global citizenship in our mission statement. And lots of liberal arts campuses do. And I think that we need to use every opportunity out there to be, questioning what is that and how are we teaching it, right? Whether it's study abroad, right? Or intergroup dialogue, right? What does it mean? What is the group, right? Where are the differences that we need to work through and work across? How we talk about civic engagement, right? Right here in New London. So I think that it's lots of, and global engagement is not something you just achieve and you've got it, right? It's an ongoing process. It's a capacity that has to be developed over time. It's kind of like the point of becoming educated, right? And so, we need to be thinking of it over the 4 years and in all dimensions of what the college experience is about and beyond. Just looking here if there's any more. I think we have a question that, unless Sourav, did you want to weigh in on the question? No. All right. So Professor Forster, you had a question?
Yeah, I do. I don't want to be like, Mr. Debbie Downer here, or whatever the phrase is, by being cynical about this. But I think, you guys talked about the way in which you know, the United States is embedded in the wider world and in the capitalist system and so on. We as an institution are also embedded in all of that, that I think hinders a lot of what you guys are talking about. So I've spent 30 years trying to get students to not just study US history. Sheetal and I have had this conversation many times. Nevertheless, in a, you know, history department that offers courses across the globe, more than half of our majors focus in US history, take the minimum number of courses outside the United States. The popular majors at the college are economics and sociology and psychology, which are, you know, somebody mentioned this earlier, are all sort of deeply US centered courses. And so we have, I'm not as optimistic about our students maybe as Sheetal is, but I think we need those students, right? We need the kids who want to come and want to study those things. So I find it sometimes hard to see how we can get to the kind of interesting global engagement that we've all been working on for so many years, because there's a kind of inertia within the system of higher education, and particularly of liberal arts colleges that are tuition dependent, that kind of which hinders in many ways our ability to do the education we want. I would say this is particularly true maybe of global engagement, but it's true of all the kind of social justice things we've been talking about here for a couple of days. There's a kind of uphill battle even among the students who are interested, even committed. They're also concerned about the jobs they're going to get and what they're going to do with their lives. So, as I say, I'm gonna sit with Sheetal someday, and she's going to make me more optimistic about our students rather than cynical about them, which I always try to avoid when I step into the classroom. But anyway, that's one of the things that's kind of been running through my head, that this all sounds great, but we got to fill the freshman class, and there's a certain kind of student who wants to come here, and how do we do that without, you know, and at the same time getting those students and our colleagues and all the structural hindrances that make this kind of global engagement difficult. So anyway, so that's my kind of slightly cynical perspective on this.
Can I just say, so Mark, you've replaced my end, which was political will, with global engagement. I'm not optimistic our students want global engagement, but I'm okay with that. In fact, I think most American kids are trained to think, oh, I'm supposed to go somewhere else and do something, and that's bad. Right? I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that actually I taught a first-year seminar this fall, and thankfully for the George Floyd protests and the pandemic, a lot of my work was already done. The students showed up deeply concerned with the state of injustice in our society. It was one of the best freshman seminars I've ever had. And that's because the world around them, meaning literally just their local environment, did a lot for them. So they showed up quite motivated to learn. What I meant when I said we confuse our students is we give them other things to do other than what they want to do. Their gut tells them something's wrong with the world, something's wrong with my environment, and I want some answers. And some of them want answers because they want to learn to conquer the system so they can be rich and go whatever. Some of them want answers because they want to change it. But I do think I think everybody has some organic, instinctual relationship with what happens around them. And education often mystifies that, right? So I don't know, it's great to be branded as the optimistic one. I was actually called a Debbie Downer when I was in college by the dean of my of my class, and he meant that as he was a huge fan of me. He called a grad school to get me in once, but I was officially called the Debbie Downer then. So I'm glad to be called the optimistic one.
I mean, one thing I would say about global engagement in terms of whether or not students want it, it's like, as we said, they're always and already globally engaged. You know, they're using all these technological devices, and you know, the coltan in your computer is mined in Central Africa and has fueled civil wars. The labor for that device in Apple is made in this Uyghur like labor camp, you know, like all of it, like even if you're just sitting in your classroom in America with your like MacBook, like because of global capitalism, you are fundamentally engaged at every moment with all of these different flows globally. I think what's unfortunate is that certain disciplines like economics seem to oftentimes be invested in building the mystique of capitalism rather than like uncovering those out of sight, out of mind aspects. You know, if you're teaching about, you know, like labor in America, how can you not talk about how Mexican farmers and Filipino farmers in California came together for the United Farm Workers for that strike? And where did those Mexicans and Filipinos come from? And what was US imperialism? I mean, it's all so connected. It's unfortunate that like some of our supposed social science disciplines have actually like dehistoricized their fields and like deal in abstractions. But I think, I don't know how you teach about things, even if you sit in America and you're not particularly interested in the world. I don't know what the point of 4 years of education is if you're not a little bit more aware of the fact that you are always and already a citizen of the world and implicated in the things that we are doing as American consumers.
I couldn't agree more. The disciplines you mentioned, Mark, econ, I think psychology, the ones that like our students flock to that are very US centered, those have to be interrupted, but there's ways to do that that don't require, you know, some of the things we have been doing.
I wonder if the present moment, right, living through this global pandemic might produce some sort of shift in orientation. You know, insofar as like it's, you know, we talk a lot about global challenges that connect us all, right? I don't know, the environment. But not everybody feels that, you know, in their daily existence in the way that we are now living through this pandemic everywhere, no matter where you are. And the fact that solutions have to be universal, they have to be global to address this. And so I wonder if there might be some sort of like reorientation in students thinking at this moment. You know, I spent the morning actually working with a group of students from Ghana and India and Russia and the United States here at Con. And one of the things that we heard from students, I mean, this is to the point that someone just made, that, you know, often we're not talking about the things that are most pressing in our students' minds. And a lot of students who applied to this program from all of these 5 institutions that we're working with, you know, so many students said, you know, the pandemic has been awful. I've had to go remote, but the worst thing is that I have to go to class and nobody is talking about the pandemic that we are living through that is like destroying lives and jobs and economies and society. I mean, all this stuff is happening and we're living through it. And, you know, we're not hearing it reflected in the classroom. And so they've, you know, they're eager, I think, to connect with each other and to work through what this actually means.
I think we should take this last question. Can we take the last question, Amy, before we wrap up? There's one more. And
oh, is there one more? Oh, yes, sorry, I missed that. So Anne, Vera Cruz has a question. Last question here.
Yes, so for me, this is really interesting because I'm a curriculum specialist and I come from education. And so curriculum theory, we always think about what we choose to include and what we choose to exclude, right? And I think that, you know, I think we should make a distinction between what we call global. Like, I think that, yes, we are in a global pandemic, but it's like, you know, when we say, oh, global engagement is everywhere. Well, what does that actually mean though? And then also additionally, when we talk about global education, I'm from the global South, you know, like, and so I've seen what these institutions are and what they do to the students of my country. And I think that there's a real question of, is global really just Western? You know, like, and I'm sorry to ask that question, but I think like, it's like, it's almost like when we think about, the popularity of global education, or what we call international education, it's almost like because of the existing global structures, meaning Western structures, that have forced us to hierarchy our way into it. Like, for example, testing, like if you've heard about these international comparative testing across different countries, like we're forced to think about and adopt these Western ways of thinking and knowing, because we are kind of graded on it, based on the Western. So for me, what's interesting about conversations about the global, because we are developing, like I don't even know what that means, is I guess like what that does to students who are then in that local place adopting this Western ways of thinking and being in relation to the local knowledges that are there. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's so yeah. So I guess my question is the distinctions. How can we better distinguish that? So I'll just, I can talk about this forever, so I just stop there.
Do either of you want to take a stab at answering this question? I mean, one thing that I'll say, I think that global does have a certain it's the buzzword, right? And often is used to, it's just a rhetorical shift, and there's nothing behind it, right? It's just the new international, right? And if you look at practices, it still is largely centered on, sort of Western Europe. I don't know that, at Con, I would love to engage in conversation with you further about the work that we're doing on our campus. And I think on a number of liberal arts campuses where we're really trying to investigate, is global really global? How global is it? I'll give you one really interesting and kind of alarming statistic. When we did an inventory of, where our students are studying, whether they're like doing internships or doing study abroad at Con. And in the past 5 years, we've sent over 1,000 students who've gone on study abroad programs. Out of that, fewer than 2% went to any country in sub-Saharan Africa. So how global are we if, we have almost an entire continent where we are not, students are not being educated. So I think that you raise an important point. Is global just a term that is, kind of covering over, the same old practices? So I think it's a good question. Sheetal or Sourav, did you want to respond? Or, we have hit our time, and I'm not sure if we're going to have our Zoom session sort of automatically ended or not. Ebony, what happens when we reach the time limit?
No, I control it, so you're good.
We don't just disappear.
You don't just disappear.
I'll just say quickly in response to Anne's question or comment that I think one of the things she's raising is sort of like, once we claim to teach the global, does what we teach change, or are we just teaching the same thing now about many different places? The example for me that comes to mind is in South Asian studies programs, there's always a Sanskritist. Sanskrit is the ancient language of India. Nobody ever spoke it. It was the language of the Brahmanical elites. And supposedly, according to the Vedas, if you were a lower caste person and you heard Sanskrit, your ear would be cut off. That's how toxic, that's how polluting it was, or whatever. That's how casteist it was. There was a Sanskritist at Columbia who thought it would be nice of him to offer scholarship for an untouchable, a Dalit, to come study Sanskrit with him. Now that's either kind and inclusive or incredibly violent, because why would a Dalit want to learn Sanskrit? And how horrible would that feel to be a Dalit person who grew up Dalit your whole life and then be trained in the language of your masters, right? So I think to me, that's what your question brought up, is like, how do we change what we teach if we're actually going to do globality, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both of you said. I think that, you know, the question is always the question of power that underlies everything, and we have to ask those questions. I think that it is oftentimes global is used as a substitute for international, and then suddenly we're thinking of the world and its tremendous diversity and complexity in the terms of like sovereign nation states, as if that's the way we should make sense of the world. And perhaps that's a useful unit of analysis for international relations, but for many other ways of understanding, it isn't. And I think, you know, it goes back to that Macaulay quote that we started with. Oftentimes, you know, during the independence movement, and, you know, Gandhi went through many iterations himself and is, I think, open to a lot of criticism. But one of the things he said, you know, when he wrote Hind Swaraj, was that the independence that most mainstream independence fighters were fighting for was not true independence, and it would just create a class of brown Englishmen, is what he said, to, you know, to take over those colonial institutions. And I do think that's a real danger with education being globalized and other forms of globalization, is that, you know, that Western hegemony and homogenization is certainly always a danger. And that's something that we have to be constantly, I guess, critically aware of and engaging as we're thinking about this.
I think that that is a good place to end. I want to thank Sourav and Sheetal for being so smart, having such a great conversation with each other. I mean, I love the fact that this ended up being a conversation with the audience. You guys were terrific, lots of questions. I feel like we probably could have had a panel that was twice as long and still kept going. And so I just want to thank everybody for attending. I know you all probably are eager to get on to the next panel or session or film as part of this wonderful Elevate conference. So I will just say thank you. Do you have any closing remarks, either of you?
No, just thank you as well. Thanks for the opportunity to engage with all of you.
Yeah, thank you for putting this together, Amy, and thanks, Sourav, for showing up.
Thank you, everyone. And if you can just do the evaluation that I'm going to put in the chat, that would be great. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.